Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading John Locke's Second Treatise on Government. Today we'll be looking at chapter 5, um, on which is basically on property. Um, this is the famous chapter. Now, um, I want to say something about property for this chapter because this chapter is probably is a very long chapter. This is actually the third longest chapter of the book with 27 sections in it. Um, uh, the second longest is chapter 10, and the first longest is, uh, I think it's the last chapter of the book, which deals with the solution of government and right revolution in that sense. So, property is one of it's the big thing. And remember, property was what he said is that property is something that's tied to liberty and life in Locke, and that this is something that is very, that one of the purposes of that civil society is done. We'll see is that for the sake of property in a sense. So let's look at what he does here. Okay, start out in section 25. Whether we consider natural reason, which tells us that men, being once born, have a right to their preservations and consequently to meat and drink, and such other things as nature affords to their sustenance, or revelation, which gives us an account of those grants God made of the world to Adam and to Noah and his sons. It is very clear that God, as King David says in Psalm 115, verse 6, has given the earth to the children of men, given it to mankind in common. But this being supposed, it seems to some a very great difficulty how anyone should ever come to have a property in a thing. I will not content myself to answer if it that if it be difficult to make out property upon a supposition that God gave the world to Adam and his posterity in common, it is impossible that any man, but one universal monarch, should have any property upon have any property upon a supposition that God gave the world to Adam and his heirs in succession, exclusive of all the rest of his property. Now, this is where he kind of, again confronts the argument divine right of king and Filmer's argument that therefore the absolute all property belongs. Um, the problem here is England and the Norman conquest. Okay, the Norman conquest is weird in that when the Normans, William the Conqueror comes in, he conquers all of England, and in England, all land really belongs to the crown in this fundamental sense. And what happens is the crown then grants use and ownership, not complete ownership. In fact, if once you've either failed, you die without, you can, in other words, the crown will give you property, land, title. Usually did that to people loyalty, bought loyalty with this. Is how he bought loyalty people, and some things. The, the Norman conquest was unique in this sense that in other words, prior to the Norman conquest, one could make the argument that most of the Anglo-Saxon England had much more in common with the continent. But after the conquest, there was a centralization of power under the crown. And what happened with land was tied to royal rule in this sense. That therefore, that in England, if in other words, if you died without heir and there was no testate heir and there was no heir to receive the land, then it reverted to the crown. Okay, if you were a traitor, you broke the norm, it reverted to the crown. Okay, In other words, the English law here um, on property assumes that there can only be property in the sense is under the crown, and therefore under government. Okay. Now Locke, and this is what the common law would teach also in that sense. There is no natural property in the sense. Natural property would be to all men would have the right to natural property. It would be what is in common. In other words, from the point of view of nature, everything is kind of like in common in that weird sense. In fact, this is what Cicero kind of teaches in his Diophages, that only in civil society does property, as we understand it, exist. In the civic order, the political order, does of a civic order, a political order, that you get property. Okay. In other words, in nature, everything is in common. Okay. Um, Now, what Locke does here is twofold. One, he gives us the principle of reasoning, chapter 25. That right reason teaches us that something about we have this need, we have natural needs, and therefore we need sustenance, and therefore this leads us to getting sustenance or enjoying sustenance. And then he relies on revelation, which is he takes from again, he takes from the Psalms, right? This Psalm 115, about that God is given to man, to mankind, you know, given to give the earth to men. But the problem here is that this would lead, if God has given the earth to man, well, atoms, and he wants to. Locke wants to avoid kind of say, listen, there's no divine right of kings, and there's no divine right. God did not give to Adam ownership, and and that goes back again to the beginning, not only the first treatise, which we're not going to go over here, but to the first chapter, in the first two sections of the first chapter, where if the first section at all, where he kind of summarizes the whole first treatise and shows how it does. In other words, that the Filmer argument just simply doesn't make sense in the sense. Now let's return here, but this being supposed, it seems to some a very great difficulty how anyone could ever come to have a property in anything. I will not content myself to answer. Okay, I'm repeating myself again. That if it be difficult to make out property upon a supposition that God gave the world to Adam and his posterity in common, it is impossible that any man but one universal monarch should have any property under a supposition that God gave the world to Adam and his heirs in succession, exclusive of all the rest of his posterity. Now, this is the rejection of the film. This is where he's saying that only that would happen. And that doesn't make sense. But I shall endeavor to show how men might have come to have a property in several parts, that of which God gave to mankind in common, and that without any express compact of all the commoners. Now, in other words, he ends the paragraph here with this position that, well, God didn't really give it to Adam, and therefore the succession where there's one monarch who owns it. No, no. Rather, God gave the world to all mankind. Okay, all can enjoy it equally. Um, okay, so what about this? So therefore, if everything's owned in common, how can you get property in this sense, in the state of nature? In other words, is property something found in nature, or is it only found in civil society? Now, Locke wants to make property a fundamental right as much as life and liberty. Okay, in other words, in fact, wants to even tie property and life fundamentally together. Now, I'm going to make a point here, and it's going to go off here. The common law in England does this, and it does this through the medieval concept of the idea that one's property is tied to oneself. In fact, if you ever study the in common law, this begins starting with the English law reform under Henry II, and then finally under Edward III. Finally, it really matures in this thing. In English law, anything after Edward III is considered ancient precedent, ancient law. So Edward is where the courts, in this sense, get the common law kind of gets a firm basis of it from Edward III onwards. And this is something that Maitland, in his famous history of the English law, also hints at. Um, this idea, but Maitland himself doesn't like this idea. But this is something that Ernst Kontotovitz, in his famous "Being the King's Two Bodies," hits on by accident. This idea that the king has two bodies, that of his physical body and then of his realm, right? Well, this is also true of all ownership of land. In other words, the Lord or the owner of the land has two bodies in a sense, this physical body of himself and the territory. And this is why in common law, when one wanted to give a land away, in other words, the land away, one had to alienate the land or the property from yourself. This is why, in fact, in land transfers and land contracts, before a land can be transferred to someone else, you needed to alienate the land. And this is why that word inalienable is in the Declaration of Independence. Something inalienable means is unable to alienate it. That means in order to transfer something under a compact or an agreement, the argument was that it had to be able to be separated from you. Now, Locke seems to suggest that certain things you cannot contract, you cannot alienate from yourself, and one of them is your life, right? And also your liberty. You can't do that. You can't let someone else to submit that self to others, right? That's that whole line that you cannot submit to slavery. You cannot submit to slavery because as you cannot kill yourself in a previous chapter, you also cannot commit yourself to slavery because that would be a violation of something you can't alienate from yourself in this fundamental sense. You can only contract away you surrender limited aspects of your. In other words, you can submit to authority, but that authority must be limited. It cannot be absolute, Locke argued earlier. So, what has happened here? Well, he's going to try to make an argument for a middle ground between all land is common and this idea of everything is given to. Hi there. Okay, we're back again. Sorry, we had a break. There was a kind of emergency. There was something that happened here. So what happened here in this sense? Let's go back to where we left off in the 26. In other words, God who hath given this world, common, right? The earth and all that there is therein given to men for their support and comfort of their being. In other words, okay, and though though all the fruit all the fruits it naturally produces and beasts it feeds belong to mankind in common. They are produced by the spontaneous hand of nature, and nobody has originally a private dominion exclusive of the rest of mankind in any of them, as they are thus in their natural state. Yet, being given for the use of men, there must be necessity by a means to appropriate them some way or another before they can be of any use or at all beneficial to a particular man. The fruit or venison which nourishes the wild Indian, who knows no enclosure and is still a tenant in common, must be his, and so his, i.e., a part of him, that another can no longer have any right to it before it can do him any good for the support of his life. Now, what is he saying here? In other words, okay, and the food you eat, right, or the nourishment you take, this is yours. This becomes yours in that sense, and no one else can have it. It's tied to you in this sense. He seemed to be saying here that there's no enclosure. In other words, the Indians who don't enclosure, he means here that there's that there's property, that there's this bit of this territory here is yours. The trees, the rules. Enclosure is a term in law, which means that a piece of land is enclosed, and that those you who this is yours. This is yours or your groups, and others aren't welcome. That others would be trespassing of this enclosure. But the Indians, he's saying, the Native Americans, in this case, he, no enclosure because they're hunter gatherers. Hunter gatherers don't have ideas of property in this sense because they travel, they follow their animals, they follow the hunters, they gather what they hunt the animals that give them sustenance, the venison, the meat. And the argument here for Locke at this point is, well, the fruits and the berries, everyone can have them. But then what happens is that when you gather them, once you've gathered them, um, now they're yours. That you can enjoy them in that sense. But that when they're out there, they're everyone's. Okay. Um, Only, in other words, the argument is that enclosure entails society. In nature, there's no enclosure. Okay, so therefore, this is why the Indian who knows no enclosure is still a tenant in common. So that everyone is this tenant, and everyone a tenant in common in English law is that you're a tenant, and everything in that area that you inhabit is common to you. Okay, everyone has an equal right. So again, this is that weird aspect of he's using the language of the common law to make a point, and I think this is a very strong point in that sense of what he's trying to do here. But the idea is that the fruit or the venison which nourishes the wild Indian is once he this is his now once he killed the animal and took in the meat. Now, if someone comes and says, "I want that meat," no, then that's not. In other words, there's something argument here that he's going to make an argument about. This is where the labor theory of value. So in other words, the action of gathering, the action of hunting, makes the thing hunted and makes the fruit or the thing yours. Okay, the labor of it, the hunting and the slaughtering and the gathering, all of this labor, human labor, makes what is common no longer common. Okay. Um, Now let's look at chapter 20, section 27. Through the earth, all the inferior creatures be common to all men. Yet every man has a property in his own person. So therefore, this idea there's a property in your own person. Okay, everything else, animals and everything else is like in common, but your person is your property. Nobody has any right but to himself. So there's no right to another person. There's only a right to yourself. But what about animals? You have right to animals, right to enjoy them. In other words, but for human beings, there's no right to control or to have another human being. What about your children? This is what about your parents responsible? That's this is something he doesn't deal with. He doesn't deal with the concept of as David Starkey says, this idea that men are born free is this nonsense in that sense. He says that following Saint Augustine, we're all born between shit and piss, right? That we're all unequal, we're all particular, we're all needy, we're not born in the world by choice. It's not our choice. We have no choice in the matter. We're thrust into the world, and we're in this state of utter dependency upon others in that sense. Locke is silent about this. He assumes that instead of born, we're kind of like, oh, these picture here, autonomic, we're there. He ignores that in other words, the chicken egg. In other words, the chicken egg, he forgets the idea is, well, where did this human being come from? We're just given the fact of a human actor and a human individual. We don't realize that this human individual came from a thing called a family, okay? And from parents in that sense. There is this kind of idea that there is this social thing that makes a person possible, right? So therefore, he's not doing this, right? So therefore, he says that nobody has anything like to himself, and the labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. So therefore, your labor and your work are yours. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature had provided and left it in, he has mixed his labor with and joined to it something that is his own, and therefore makes it his property. So remember, I said that the act of gathering, the fruit or the grain or the thing from the earth, this act is making that thing that's common, that's all can enjoy, the act of taking it. But what happens when other people want it? This is the thing that he doesn't address. What happens when, okay, we see these fruit. I want the fruit, but the other guy wants the fruit. Well, okay, no, but I took the fruit already. It's mine. Okay, the fact that we're taking the fruit first. Now he comes and says, "I want the fruit." Now, if he tries to take it from you, this would be the imposition of power on another. This would be basically the act of war, right? So therefore, there is this idea that Locke. The problem becomes that the conflict between the parties emerges when the parties are disputing who owns something, who has who's until now. What happens when the number of things that's only like one person can enjoy, get this to eat to survive? Okay, these berries or this food or this animal. Okay, um, then they're fighting about who has the right to take it. This leads to war in that sense, competition. So therefore, scarcity. When there's no, when there's not, in other words, when there's scarcity, then therefore, this a conflict will emerge here. It seems to me, in this sense, for Locke, and that's how he explains how the state of nature goes into the state of war in that sense. But let's continue here, right? In other words, we talked about his making his property joined to his that makes his own and therefore makes his property. It being by him removed from the common state of nature hath placed it in it. It has by his labor something annexed to it that excludes the common right of others, men. For this labor being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what that is one joined to, and least where there is enough and as good left in common for others. So therefore, as long as there's enough, there's not going to be this is in other words, but there's the idea that once you've labored it, once you've worked on it, once you've done something, some effort, it's now yours. Okay, your labor is yours, and therefore any labor things something you do an effort to that joins with that thing to the labor now becomes yours, your property. So therefore the origin of property is tied to labor for Locke. This is what, in other words, and this tied, what is that? Labor is our actions, the actions of our body, our person. So Locke, and this is where labor theory of value comes, that all value of something comes from the labor intent. This is something that David Ricardo will embrace. Not Adam Smith. Adam Smith really doesn't get into the division of labor. I mean, not division of labor, but the labor theory of value that much. But Ricardo and others will, and then Marx will take it and revolutionize it. But the idea that labor theory of value, that value of something, the value, and therefore there's objective value based upon the labor of something, it emerges out from Locke here. Locke is the father of this idea, and the mischief of its cost. The Marxism. Lone labor theory of value, no labor theory. This idea that value comes from labor. Um, what have an objective value because of the amount of labor and effort of something. Um, this makes no end of mischief because through Marx. Um, So let's continue here. He says, it being removed by common state of nature, so that personal property of labor, no man can have the right to that, to what that he once joined to, at least where there's enough and as good left in common for others. So, that, in other words, there's not a problem if there's enough. If there are enough, in other words, there's a weird thing. Things won't go. There won't be a big problem if there's enough of things. So if there's not radical scarcity. If there's radical scarcity, and if I work and take this, others can't work and take it and survive. Therefore, there will be a conflict of this. This is for Hobbes. This begins right away. Okay, because you have the right to whatever you want, and there's no judge determine who's the right. Everyone's right is equals everyone else, and therefore this leads to the war of all against all in Hobbes. For Locke, Locke kind of says, well, as long as there's enough, people won't fight. But then once there's radical scarcity, then this will lead to the conflict of war of all against all. Chapter 28. He that is nourished by the acorn he picked up under an oak, or the apples he gathered from the tree in the woods, has certainly appropriated them to himself. Nobody can deny but the nourishment is his. I asked him, when did they begin to be his? When he digested, or when he ate, or when he boiled, or when he brought them home, or when he picked them up? And it is plain, it is the first gathering made them not. If the first gathering had not made them his, nothing else could. So we have this long logical chain. When did it become his? When he ate it? No, when it first becomes his. When he digested it, or when he ate it, or when he boiled it, or when he brought it home, or when he picked it up. And now the argument is, if this doesn't make it his, when he gathered it, then these other ones don't have any claim either. Nothing else could. Right? That's that line here. That's that, So that the gathering, the picking them up is that which that labor put a distinction between them and the common. So the fact that I gathered it, the fact that I took it, that this is no longer something that is common. So the agency, the human agency of taking it and just taking it, gathering it, doing something with it, hunting the animal. In other words, all this, it becomes a unique moment of your labor that transitions it for something common. So therefore, wait a minute, taking? The act of taking? And here, okay, again, this is another problem. What happens? If the making it yours is the act of taking? But what happens when there's competition about the taking? Whose is it then? There is no answer here. There's no answer there for that in the state of nature in that sense. In other words, that question is not answerable in the state of nature in that sense. Okay, now let us look at this next part. Okay, that labor put a distinction between them and common, and he added something to them more than nature, the common mother of all. Nature is the common mother of all, he says here, right? Now, and my taking or my gathering or my work, my labor, I add something to it, right? That's more than what nature provides. Okay. Had done, and so they became his private right. So my act of doing adds more than what nature provides, and therefore it becomes my private right. Okay, that becomes his private right. And will anyone say he had no right to those acorns or apples he thus appropriated because uh, 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 he had not the consent of all mankind to make them his. In other words, unless, okay, now here's the other problem. The my taking it has not all consented to this. Shouldn't all consent? If this is common and all have an equal right, for anyone to enjoy a right in this sense wouldn't require the consent of others. Okay. In other words, this is the line that because in other words, consent. In other words, he's because he had not the consent of all mankind to make them his. Was it a robbery thus to assume to himself what belonged to all in common? So was it taking a kind of robbery? It's not, this is the alternative. The argument is okay. Um, if such a consent as that was necessary, man had starved, notwithstanding the plenty God had given him. In other words, if that was required, everyone had to agree. In other words, all had to agree. That's not going to be likely. In other words, he does this. He kind of realizes that if common consent of all is required, then humanity would starve. Why? Because that's very hard to get a uniform consent. In fact, that's why any kind of thing that requires unanimity ensures that nothing gets done. It's very difficult to get agreement. The larger the scale, in other words, the fact that you have to get all humanity and all has to agree to it, men would starve. He would say. So he's using a probability argument of unlikelihood of total unanimity of consent to make an argument that can't be the real logic. But what happens if it is the logic? Okay. I mean, what happens is that consent is required in that sense. If something is in common and it belongs to all, right? Why is it the taking of something theft in one case and not theft in others? The idea, because it becomes his, because once it theft is taking something that belongs to another, right? But if these things belong to all and that he took him for his use, the argument is that his labor entailed it. Now, this is the question of well, wait a minute, but what happens if his use then precludes others from also enjoying it, okay? Or of using it, or having it? Well, the argument is that the early sentence was that there was enough around. But what happens if there is not enough around? Okay. In other words, if it was a consent that was necessary, man had starved, notwithstanding the plenty of God had given him. We see in comments, which remain so by compact, that it is the taking any part of what is common and removing it out of the state of nature leaves it in, which begins property. In other words, once we take it out of nature, it becomes property. Okay. His argument is once we take it out into agreement of something, or even the act of it becomes property. Without which the common is of no use. And the taking of this or that part does not depend on the express consent of all the commoners. Thus the grass my horse has bit, the turf my servant has cut, or the ore I have digged in any place, where I have a right to them in common with others, becomes my property without the assignation or consent of anybody. Again, what he's doing is this is basically the common law about what is the commons. In other words, he's taking the English law regarding the commons of this time, which is positive law, okay, not natural law. But this is the law of England, and he's making it a universal. Locke seems to be taking the provision of the common law, this assumption that, well, in a common, in the area that is common, that's shared by all, that my horse eats the grass there, or all the other horses eat the grass there. That's the purpose of it. All can benefit from it. It belongs to no man. It belongs to all, right? That's always the problem of tragedy commons. Since no one owns it, no one cares for it, and therefore it goes to rot, right? But at the same time, that's the famous argument Aristotle makes against common property. But here in English law, the commons were usually landed areas, trees, and things that that the people held, the residents or the people who lived in a community held, that allowed that it was to be shared by all. It was not going to be owned by anyone, and therefore this is usually set for grazing and things like that for the animals. And therefore this idea is that, well, because it was common, the fact that my horse ate it, I doesn't need the permission of others, right? This is that whole line here, right? Express concern of all commoners. In other words, that famous line, dignity of place and the right I have common with others became my property without the assignation or consent of that body, right? The labor that was mine, removing them out of the common state they were in, had fixed my property to them. So they're my effort. In other words, property becomes that my effort. Anytime I exert effort on doing something or making something, that becomes mine. But what happens if there's a finite amount of things and that becomes yours, and that without that, then everyone else doesn't have, and no one else has any, and other people want it as well? Okay, doesn't this lead to kind of a problem, a conflict? Isn't that is that? I mean, the fact that I take it or make it, but this does not apply to human beings, but it applies to animals and the material world. Okay, see this thing happens here now. 29. By making explicit consent of every commoner necessary to any one appropriating himself any part of what is given in common, children or servants could not cut the meat which their father or master had provided them in common, without assigning to every one of his particular part. Through the water running in the fountain to be everyone's. Yet who can doubt but that in the pitcher, in the pitcher is only who drew it out, the pitcher. So water in the fountain belongs to everyone, but I put water in the pitcher. This is mine, right? His labor has taken it out of the hands of nature, where it was common, and belongs equally to all her children, has thereby appropriated itself to him. So this idea that you can take it, this becomes yours. Now Locke Rousseau in the Second Discourse has the argument, but others have to, the fact that this moment of someone says this is mine, a famous line, society begins the second when someone claims this property is mine and everyone agrees. Now this can happen because no one bothers, but there's no conflict about this, there's no contestation about this, but because everyone's afraid, because there's not people are not in society, and therefore, but society emerges once property is made for in Rousseau. Now Rousseau seems to be, I think Rousseau is getting this here. This is where society merges. That there is a consent. In other words, there is a consent, an unstated consent by others to this. Has to be. If there's not a consent, then there's conflict. Okay. Section 30. Thus, this law of reason makes the deer the Indian who has killed it. It is allowed to be his goods, who hath bestowed his labor upon it, though before it was the common right of everyone. Okay, therefore, I hunted it, I did it. That makes it that deer becomes mine by my hunting. Before the deer was everyone's, right? But the fact that I hunted it and I did it, it becomes mine, right? And among those who are counted in the civilized part of mankind, who hath made the multiplied positive laws to determine property, this original law of nature for the beginning of property, which was before common, still takes place, and by virtue thereof what fish anyone catches in the ocean, that great and still remaining common of mankind, or what ambergris anyone takes up, takes has takes up here, is by a labor that removes it out of the common state of nature, left in, made his property. Who takes that pains about it? Who takes that the pains about it? And even among us, the hare that anyone is hunting is thought his who pursues her during the chase. For being a beast that is still looked upon as common, no man's private possession, whoever has employed so much labor about any of that kind, and so finds and pursues her, has thereby removed her from the state of nature, wherein she was common, and hath begun a property. So even the examples that he gives here, the hare, the rabbit, the hare in the woods, what happens to the woods are common, but what happened about this is my property, and then the hare goes here. This hare, well, the idea is that the hare is not your property. You don't consider it your property. In other words, the question is poaching, right? This is that problem in English common law, right? English law, the problem of poaching. That once people and lords and people enclosed area, even the animals in that closed area are now perceived as theirs. Okay, no longer in the common area. So what about the guy who goes in this someone's enclosed area and hunts the wild animals? Okay, in civil law, that's a crime. You're trespassing, and not only trespassing, you're poaching. That's the word. But wait a minute, these are not your chickens and farm animals. They're not take stealing. And that's why it's not. If you went in there and stole their cow, poaching is not theft in this normal sense. It is something different. It's engaging in illegal trespass and taking the animals or things, hunting without permission in that sense, right? Um, but this is what's there. In other words, now 31. It will perhaps be objected to this, that if it gathers acorns or other fruits of the earth, etc., and makes a right to them, then any one may engross as much as he wills. To this I answer, not so. In other words, okay, what happens? Then if I just get as much as I can, it becomes mine. No, no, no. See, the argument is what happens if my effort alone to do it, it makes it mine. Then what happens if I just keep on taking everything? That makes doesn't it become this also? And he goes, no, this is no. He says, right, as the same law of nature that does not by means give us property. The same law of nature that does not by means give us property does also bound that property too. God has given us all things richly. Again, this is from 1 Timothy verse 6, line 12. Chapter 6, 1 Timothy chapter 6, line 12. Is the voice of reason confirmed by inspiration? But how far has he given it to us? To enjoy. So in other words, how far has he given us this right to do this, to enjoy these things? He says to enjoy. Okay, that's the important point here. In other words, enjoy means to use. Okay, so let's continue here. As much as anyone can make use of to any advantage of life before it spoils, so much he may by his labor fix a property. Whatever is beyond this is more than his share and belongs to others. Whoa! So there's a limit. In other words, it's not an infinite. In other words, your effort and your labor and your right to take the comments and to do it. You can only take as much as you can enjoy or use. If you take more than what you can enjoy or use or need in a sense, no, 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 no. This is a violation of this. Nothing was made by God for man to spoil or destroy. So therefore, if I take it and I don't use it and it's destroyed or spoiled, if I kill the animal but don't eat it, I just killed it for killing its sake. Well, that's destroying it, not using it. In other words, I'm not using it for my enjoyment. Well, what happens? My enjoyment is by enjoyment here means use. My use of it. See, the problem here is this is where Locke and Locke Hobbes has a better psychology. It's more honest because he says, well, the problem here is what happens. Will is subjective. What our desires is subjective. In other words, what we can have imagination. In other words, a human being can will a lot of things, and he can imagine his own artificial thing in that sense. So he could imagine. In other words, I can have an unlimited desire. Where Locke seems here to impose a limit on things, and assumes that the common view of script, usually taken from Scripture, he uses that authority of Scripture to kind of back up a kind of more limited position than Hobbes. Hobbes is dictated by the logic of his psychology. In other words, you have this leads us to a certain kind of dynamic that leads us to a certain conclusion. Locke seems to all of a sudden always rhetorically limit it here. That God has made was made by God for man to spoil or destroy. Thus is considered the plenty of natural possessions. There was a long time in the world and a few spenders, and to how small a part that provision, the industry of one man could extend himself, and engross it to produce prejudice of others, especially keeping within the bounds set by reason of what might serve his use. There could be little room for quarrels or contentions without property so established. In other words, given the vast source of resources in this, see, Locke's understanding is that there's not going to be competition, that there's not going to be scarcity, radical scarcity, or scarcity in any sense of the word, because it's going to be very difficult for any man to really use and enjoy everything. We're not allowed to spoil it, not to destroy it. So therefore, I just can't. In other words, there's always going to be some, and therefore I can't keep on taking everything, just hoarding it and holding it for me becomes mine. All these extra apples and all these extra things that other people can't have because now it's mine. I took them all. But remember, what only makes my taking mine is that my use of it. So if I'm not using it and spoiling it, no, then what about that? I take the apple and I'm not using it. This is that famous discussion of in Saint Augustine of going into the neighbor's garden and stealing the pear. Is the taking the pear from the guy's pear tree, is that theft? Right? Locke would say, in one sense, okay, yes, that's his enclosure. Maybe you should not do it. But in the natural sense, that is not theft because is he enjoying it? No, it's going to spoil. And you taking it, if he's not going to take it and use it and to enjoy it, then okay, maybe you could take it in that weird sense in Locke here. And this is the state of nature. Okay, this is where all of a sudden there's a limit to what labor can do that becomes yours. This is the contradiction in the labor theory of value in Locke. This idea of labor making property. That wait a minute, there's a limit because of what you can enjoy or use. If you can't use it or enjoy it in that sense, and it's going to be waste. But wait a minute, what happens if it's not waste? What happens? I can find mechanisms that I can enjoy this future. I can take all the apples and I'm going to boil and make applesauce and seal them in that, and I can store them for years, and therefore I have enough for my future long use. But no one else can have it. Okay, you see the thing? Doesn't this create a problem of competition? That therefore this idea that he says that this weird line that given that there's few spenders, right, and how great this provision is going to extend itself and engross, and it's going to be in other words, that the provision of industry of one man could extend itself and engross it to the prejudice of others is unlikely. In other words, a few spenders. And so small a part of that provision, the industry of one man could extend itself. But wait a minute, really? What happens if I know about boiling it and I might make applesauce? Okay, I get all the apples and all the trees, make lots of applesauce, so I have applesauce forever. I'm enjoying it. I'm not wasting it. I will enjoy it in the future. See, that's the thing that Locke's model doesn't really count. That for investment in future, it only assumes the now. So I'm not going to, in other words, those excess apple jars of applesauce, I'm not eating them now. So therefore, it may be not yours. You understand? When does it become yours? He says, the making it may become yours. Remember that line. But then I made it. Mine. All this is mine. But he makes this assumption here. Oh, it's going to be unlikely that the effort, the industry of one man that can accomplish all that. Okay, maybe not. That's an assumption. It assumes that the resources are much more finite than the people seeking after them. What happens if that's not true? Okay, let's continue here. Okay, expand them and engross to the prejudice of others. Especially keeping within the bounds set by reason of what might serve his use. Right, this idea that limits our concept of use. There can be then little room for quarrels or contentions about property sources. But this is the idea that because there's it's going to be so much resources, so many things. This natural resource is not going to be competition. It's not going to be sources of contention. Hobbes would say, horse hockey, Mr. Locke. Mr. Locke, you're lying here. You're assuming that that you're ignoring that you're completely ignoring the possibility of scarcity. You're ignoring the fact that some people might presume their industry and their effort and their labor to think of longer periods of use. The use now. But if I can find a way that I can not waste and spoil, but rather, like I said, the applesauce, right? Make infinite amount of applesauce. I can always enjoy my applesauce. If I can find ways to take slaughter all the animals, but then I don't have any future animals, right? In other words, this is the contradiction of some things here. Let's go now 32. But the chief matter of property being now not the fruits of the earth and the beasts of the system, but the earth itself, as that which takes in and carries with it all the rest. I think it is plain that property in that too is acquired as the former. In other words, properties of land. How does land? Okay, labor on it. In other words, this is you first said about the fruits of the earth and the beasts. Now, what about land itself? How does that become yours? And he says that this the same way is that labor, right? As much as a man, as much land as a man tills, plants, improves, cultivates, and can use the product of, so much is his property. I mean, in one sense, this is the right. Once you the idea that property in land, emerges in agrarian society. Once you start farming, once you start cultivating the land, once you start doing something with the land, this is the labor here becomes here. This is the idea that labor comes here, and that therefore you have this you have this moment in Locke where, okay, land now becomes the property, and that because of labor, agriculture, in this sense. By this, his labor does, as it were, enclose it from the common. So therefore, that the fact that my labor now makes this land mine, right? This earth was everyone's, but now because my labor, my cult. See, what Hobbes would say that no, in the state of nature that I have the right to whatever I want. So if I, until society's created, the fact that I planted something in here and that grows, how is it yours? I don't necessarily recognize. I see the fruit of your labor. I don't necessarily know you planted it. So remember, Locke says, Hobbes says this leads to the fact that I see you planting it, but now you're not there, and I can go take your carrots, your things that you planted, and enjoy it. But that's theft now because of property. But no, is it theft in that sense? Is it theft in that fun? Yes, it is, in not a Locke sense. But Hobbes would argue that you can't escape that. That's always going to happen because people are going to pick the easiest way to do things, and therefore this is why. And actually, you don't see. In other words, until there's the creation of society or some norms and laws, you don't get agricultural. There's if you don't get some institutional thing. In other words, the hunter gatherers do create units, families, and tribes that sees themselves as a body or people. That then, from an anthropological point of view, then what happens is that all of a sudden that people then discovers agriculture. Well, they have customs, they have habits, they have rules that shape their behavior. And that becomes the rules by which then that law. In other words, they've already created a series of norms and rules and customs through their life together. That is not simply just basically them living in nature. Okay, the immersions of the hunter gatherers, and once they create families and tribes, there's norms and cons. There are contracts. Therefore there is society. There's social bonds and social relations that here Locke doesn't want to talk about. So therefore, a lot of this view of agriculture that he's talking about, this once you labor here, you're doing it here, right? Let's continue what this says here. Common man, labor, in other words, nor should it invalidate his right to say that everyone else has an equal title to it, and therefore he cannot enclose without the consent of his fellow commoners, all mankind. God, when he gave the world in common to all mankind, commanded men also to labor, and the penury of his condition required it of him. In other words, remember that's from Adam's. It's not for you. You should work. You should do. In other words, you should toil. You should toil and stuff. That's the curse God gave to Adam, right, and man, for eating eating the apple and being expelled from paradise, right? God in his reason commanded him to subdue the earth. But by subduing the earth means to improve it for the benefit of life, and therein lay out something upon it that was his own, his labor. So therefore, in other words, he takes this idea of God, the biblical injunction to labor, to toil, and to subdue the earth, okay, which is a curse. In other words, the paradise was that everything was going to be beneficial to him, and that he could he has without work. Now it isn't. He's going to in order to live, he needs to work, and he needs to subdue the earth in order to survive, right? So therefore, this is what for the Bible is kind of like the consequence of sin and the consequence of man's disobedience, and therefore punishment. now becomes the natural condition for Locke in this sense, and therefore conditions him to kind of do something, right? God in his reason commanded him to subdue the earth, i.e., approve it for the benefit of his life, and therein lay out something upon it that was his own, his labor. He that in obedience to his command of God subdued, tilled, and sowed any part of it, thereby annexed it to something that was his property, which another had no title to, nor could without injury take from him. So therefore, by tilling it, by things, makes it yours, it becomes your property, and no one else has a right to it. Okay. Now, this is where Locke and Hobbes really fundamentally disagree. Hobbes does not believe you can have property until you have law. Locke here seems to make an argument that property exists prior to law, prior to society, by one's own effort in this sense. And he does this by bringing the biblical authority. He's relying heavily here on the Bible and the understanding. But then he changes the meaning of the Bible. Because remember, what was this command of subduing the earth? It was, again, not a positive thing. It was the punishment after being expelled. Okay, so therefore, let's look at this. Now, 31. Nor was the appropriation of any parcel of land by improving it any prejudice to any other man, since there was still enough. Okay, still enough. No prejudice. If I'm going to make it, if I effort and I do it, so as long as, in other words, there's no prejudice by the fact that I labor on it or make it, there's not, by this act alone isn't prejudicing, because there's enough of land. Again, this idea that there's no scarcity of ownership of land. There's plenty. The Lockean assumption is there's plenty. In other words, the land and the things are many and the people are few. But what happens if the people are many and the land is few? Okay, Locke. In other words, the state of nature would be really Hobbes. In other words, Hobbes is. In other words, what Hobbes is. In other words, Locke's happy state of nature only happens not because of man, but because of the lack. In other words, the scale of the world and the smallness of the population. Okay, an accident. That once that's changed, then you get Hobbes. Hobbes is war against all, right? So what happened here? He goes, God in his reason commanded him to subdue the earth and prove it the benefit of life, and therefore take something upon it that was his own labor, his labor. He that in obedience to this command of God subdued, tilled, towed, and part of it, and whereby annexed it, and it was his property, which upon no one had a title to or could without injury take it from him. So remember, I repeated myself there. Section 33. Nor was this appropriation of any parcel of land by improving any prejudice to the other's man, since there was still enough. I read this. Okay. And as good left, and more than yet unprovided could use. So therefore, plenty of land. The argument here is, what happens is that true? If that's not true, then this is not true. Okay. So that in effect, there was never the less left for others because of his enclosure for himself. That he that leaves as much as another can make use of, does a good as take nothing at all. But nobody could think himself injured by by the drinking of another man, although he took a good draught, who has a whole river of the same water left to quench his thirst. And the case of land and water, where there is enough of both, the same, and it is perfectly the same. But what happens if there's not? What is there not enough of water so that in that river that everyone can enjoy it? You understand? Okay. Then this model falls apart. Okay, this argument falls apart. Section 34. God gave the world to men in common, but since he gave it to them for benefit and the greatest conveniences of life they were capable to draw from it, it cannot be supposed that he meant should always remain common and uncultivated. In other words, he says, in other words, the idea that what is common should always remain common and cultivated. He intended that, in other words, he seems to argue that what God gave in common and for the benefit and for the conveniences of life means that it didn't intend it not to be uncultivated, right? Always remain in common and always remain cultivated. He gave it for the use of the industrious and the rational. And labor was to be his title to it. So labor was the mechanism that entitled the industrious and the rational. Not to the fancy or the covetous, of the quarrelsome and the contentious. So wait a minute, it's labor and effort, not that gives right, not contention, the covetous, envy. I see you have it, therefore I have a right to it also. See, again, this is almost a explicit kind of saying, I don't agree with Hobbes that in the state of nature man would have a right to whatever he wants, and that therefore the state of nature would lead to the war of all against all by definition. And what he does is he makes a special case that, there's plenty, as long as there's so much that there's not going to be this conflict that Hobbes points out, because there's not going to be fight over the water. Everyone can enjoy their little, even if I take a swig, there's enough water out there for the rest of us. Okay? My swig does not deprive other people of having their water, the argument goes. But what happens if it did? Okay? Now he's saying that in other words, not fancy or covetous and the quarrelsome and contentious. Those are, in other words, it's for God gave this for our use, and our labor, right? Our labor grants it to us, and this is to the industrious and the rational, not to the fancy or the covetous or of the quarrelsome and the contentious. He that had as good left for his improvement as was already taken up need not complain, although ought not to meddle with what was already improved by another's labor. If he did, it is plain he desired the benefit of another's pains, which he had no right to, and not the ground which God has given him in common with others to labor on. And whenceforth there was a good whereof there was as good left, and as that already possessed, and more than he knew what to do with, or his industry could reach to. So, but notice he's saying here that there's no right. You can't come and want my land. If I improve this land, that land isn't improved. You can have that land. You can go over there and take that land and use it and utilize. But I want this one. It's already there. Nice house, nice things. Well, you can't have that because you didn't work on it. I've already done it, and this is no longer common. This is now mine, and for you to take it now is to impose by it being yours, it becomes part of you. In this sense, again, he's relying on this common law assumption of property being tied to the person. Remember, an estate is your person. In other words, in England, in the older rules of the medieval world, if you have a barony or knight, right, you have two names. You have your name and you have a right or a thing that has a status and a legal status that is as much you as your family name in that sense, right? Warwick, the Earl of Warwick is Warwick, okay, as much as he has a real name from his family. The bishop of this place, the bishop of Ely, right, The Diocese of Ely is his territorial uh, tenant, right? Therefore, he's Ely as much as he has his real name. Okay, so therefore, this is also true about all landholders or possessions of property or titles and inheritors. They are this is theirs. Remember, I talked about it earlier in the video that in order to transfer it, you had to make it not yours and you had to alienate it from it, right? So let's go here to the next part, right? 35. It is true that the land that is in common in England or any other country where there is plenty of people under government who have money and commerce, no one can enclose or appropriate any part without the consent of his fellow commoners, because this is left common by compact, i.e., by the law of the land, which is not to be violated. So, therefore, he's not talking about the existing laws. Okay, that laws may set up commons, and once these set up commons, this common differs from nature, where that in nature you can work on it and take it becomes yours. But now, because we have set this aside that everyone can use it, therefore it cannot be violated without you cannot go in here and use it without the consent of everyone, because it was made by compact, by the law of the land, which is not to be violated. And although it be common in respect of some men, it is not so to all mankind, but is joint property of this country or this parish. Besides, the remainder after such enclosures would not be as good to the rest of the commoners. So the whole was when they could make use of the whole, whereas the beginning and the first peopling of the great common of the world, it was quite otherwise. And therefore, once all of a sudden, the beginning origins of this, when the beginning of the peopling of the environment, there is this excessive things. But now, once you have society and you have these things like this, then you have commons in society under law. This land usually is not the best land. This is what remains, and therefore it's still used for this purpose in that sense. Um, and therefore, peopling in the great commons of what was quite otherwise. The law that the law man was under was a rather for appropriating. In other words, the original law of nature was one of appropriating. God commanded that his wants forced him to labor. That this his property, which could not be taken from him wherever he had fixed it, and hence subduing or cultivating the earth and having dominion, we have see are joined together. Again, Locke is completely relying on the biblical authority for this argument here. Okay, he's now using reasoning to justify it, but this is kind of a he's relying on the biblical claim here. But wait a minute, again, this assumes that the beginning of the man, the beginning of the thing, not something where there's a scarcity and limit to things, right? Once the one gave the title to the other, so that God, by commanding to subdue, gave authority so far to appropriate, and the conditions of human life, which requires labor and material to work on, necessarily introduces private possessions. So, to what degree does this argument depend upon the validity of the scripture, the idea of a God who commands this? Well, there's no God. This is not, no, Locke doesn't. Locke assumes that there's this God and the scripture is giving authority, and reason and scripture kind of agree here. Okay. But what happens if, wait a minute, reason alone, not scripture, no authority. Let's not take these myths. Can you justify this on reason alone? He doesn't give an argument for reason alone here. 36. The measure of property nature will well set by the extent of men's labor and the conveniences of life. No man's labor could subdue or appropriate all. In other words, there was no man's labor or could subdue or appropriate all. Nor could his enjoyment consume more than a small part, so that it was impossible for any man this way to entrench upon the right of another, or to acquire to himself a property to the prejudice of his neighbor, who would still have room as good and as large a possession after the other had taken out his, as before it was appropriated. This measure could confine every man's possession to a very moderate portion, in such as he might appropriate to himself without injury of anybody. In the first ages of the world, again, this is this idea that there was this few people and lots of property, and that therefore the taking of this property, there's no way one person can use and take and enjoy and use, and not only this, take and possess and subdue everything, that it would be at the expense of another, that he wasn't going to spoil or waste. In other words, again, this is this idea of the limit. When men were more in danger to be lost, in other words, when men are more in danger to be lost by wandering from their company in the vast wilderness of this earth, than to be straitened for want of room to place in. So therefore, more is that men get lost. Men go in the wilderness, get lost, and not. In other words, Locke seems to kind of make the argument here that there's plenty of room, that it's easiest to want, is that there's not this limit to the goods that people can utilize, and the vast wilderness and the earth, than to be straitened from want of room to plant in. In other words, there's infinite space. Man can be easily lost, versus that there's no room for people. Okay, there's plenty of room and plenty of areas where people can take and make their own. This is the beginning of the earth, right? But later that's not the case, right? And the same measure may be allowed still without prejudice to anybody, as full as the world seems. For supposing a man or a family in the state they were at the first peopling of the world by the children of Adam and Noah, let him plant in some inland vacant place of America, we shall find that the possessions he could make himself upon the measures we have given would not be very large, not even to this day prejudice even the rest of mankind, or give them reason to complain, or think themselves injured by this man's encroachment, though the race of man has now spread themselves to all the continents of the world, and do indefinitely exceed the small numbers that was in the beginning. Nay, the extent of ground is of so little value without labor, that I have heard it affirmed that in Spain itself a man could be permitted to plow, sow, and reap without being disturbed upon the land he had no other title to, but only his making use of, by only his making use of it. But on the contrary, the inhabitants thinks themselves beholden to him, who by his industry on neglected and consequently wasteland, his increase of the stock of corn, which they wanted. But be this as it will, which I lay no stress on, this I dare boldly affirm, that the same rule of property, viz., that every man should have as much as he could make use of, would still hold in the world without straining anybody, since there is enough land enough in the world to suffice the double of the inhabitants, had not the invention of money and the tacit agreement of men to put value on it, introduced by consent larger possessions, and a right to them, which now, as it's done, I shall, and by show more at large. Now he says money changes things. In other words, once you create money and attach the value of money to land, then, in other words, before the creation of money, there's not there's a limit to what one can own and enjoy. But once you create money, there's no limit. This is very Aristotelian. Aristotelian says that, but Aristotle's weird. Aristotle here in money is both a natural, but it's necessary for trade that is natural. It's that interest making is unnatural, and that this is where the danger comes. Okay, for in Aristotle, book one. Um, for Locke, money becomes the big problem. Aristotle, money becomes a means by which trade becomes better and man's society is necessary. It's kind of like the regime or the politeia in Aristotle. This is also by convention, but it is something that helps fulfill what is natural. It helps the natural to be bettered. Okay, therefore it's not a wholly artificial. It is something intended, something that the natural needs man to actualize in order to fulfill the natural thing. Therefore, the man trade is here. What money does is it makes trade easier. Okay. The danger of the money is that once you can make interest from it, make money from money, then there's no limit to it. In trade, there's always limit. Again, to use. Therefore, this idea that he talks about, there's a use limit. This is again Locke continually uses a hooker and this Aristotelianism as kind of like a protection or a shield against the accusation that he's innovating. Okay, um, so let's look at this a little more closely in that sense. Um, this This is certain that at the beginning, before the a desire of having more than man needed had altered the intrinsic value of things, which depends only on their usefulness to man's life, or had agreed that a little piece of yellow metal, which could keep without wasting or decay, should be worth a great piece of flesh, or a whole heap of corn, though men had a right to appropriate by their labor, each one for himself, of such of a thing of nature as he could. Yet this could not be much, nor to the prejudice of others, where the same plenty was still left to those who could use the same industry. To which, let me add, that he who appropriates land to himself by his labor does not lessen but increase the common stock of mankind, for the provisions serving to the support of human life, produced by 1 acre of enclosed and cultivated land, are, so to speak, within, so to speak, much within compass, 10 times more than those which are yielded in an acre of land of equal richness, laying waste in common. In other words, he makes it the cultivation and the cultivating of land produces more produce than 10 times as much. That's even higher today with things than what would be that if no one cultivated it, right? Um, Equally laying waste in common, right? And therefore, he that encloses land and has a great plenty of the contrivances of life from 10 acres, then he could have from 100 left to nature, may truly be said to give 90 acres to mankind, for his labor now supplies him with provisions out of 10 acres, which were but a produce of 100th lying in common. I have here rated the improvement of land. I have rated the improvement of land very low in making its product but as 10 to 1, when it is much nearer to 100 to 1. For I ask, whether in the wild woods or uncultivated waste of America, left to nature, without any improvement, tillage, or husbandry, 1,000 acres yield needy and wretched inhabitants as many any contrivances of life as 10 acres of equally fertile land do in Devonshire, where they are well cultivated. In other words, he makes this radical point that cultivation improves nature, makes it more fruitful. And therefore, by cultivating the land, one actually provides man a better, more useful benefit than just by nature does it. And this is this is why hunter-gatherer societies can never be that big, because until they uh, enclosed land and created farms and cultivated the land, they could not produce the large amount of food by which they could produce larger populations. This is why all this Native American genocide bullshit is bullshit, because it doesn't. I mean, the hunter gatherers could not. You could not have large tribes being hunter gatherers. This wasn't possible. Their sizes were small and had to be small. So there was never this great population of Indians. They were always very small. This is the and this is the thing about the state of nature. The state of nature, in this Lockean sense, can only be small because they're people hunter gathering. There's not enough food. If you get too big of a people consuming that land, it's not enough. Then you have scarcity. So therefore, you can't have the mass increase of population can only happen once you have cultivation, because that 100 acres of land, that 10 acres of land, not only produces what used to be 100, but it produces what used to be 1,000 or 2,000. Okay, several thousand. So therefore, this creates a big benefit that more people can live off that land. So therefore, the size of the population can be bigger than what nature could provide. Okay. Again, this is the idea that once you have the cultivation, this is why we say culture, right? Culture from cultivation. That we can have these larger societies only because we have the cultivation of the land and the food production that provides. Whereas before, hunter gatherers could never provide that large scale population, couldn't survive, it collapsed. Okay. Before the appropriation of land, he who gathered as much as a wild free, killed or caught or tamed as much of the beast as he could, he that so employed his pains without any of the spontaneous products of nature, and as any way to alter them from the state of which nature put them, by placing any of his labor on them, whereby acquiring a did whereby acquire a property in them. But if they perished in his possession without due use, if the fruit rotted or the venison putrefied, before he could spend it, he offended against the common law of nature and was liable to be punished by he invaded his neighbor's share, for he had no right further than his use called for any of them, and they might serve to afford him convenient. They might have served afford him convenience of life. Right. 38. The same measures govern the possession of land too, whereso he tilled and reaped, laid up and made use of, before it spoiled. That was his particular right. Whatsoever he enclosed could feed and make use of. The cattle and product was also his. And if he had, but if he either the grass of his enclosure rotted on the ground, or the fruit he was planting perished without gathering and laying up, this part of the earth, notwithstanding his enclosure, was still to be looked upon as waste, and might be the possession of another. Thus, at the beginning, Cain might take as much ground as he could till and make it his own land, and yet leave enough to Abel's sheep to feed on. A few acres would serve for both, of their possession. But as families increased and the industry enlarged their stock and their possessions, enlarged with them, with the need of them, but yet it was commonly without any fixed property in the ground they made use of till they incorporated, settled themselves together, and built cities. And then by consent, they came in time to set out the bounds of their district territories and agree upon limits between them and their neighbors, and by laws within themselves settled the properties of those of the same society. For we see that the part of the world which was first inhabited and therefore like to be the best people, even as low down as Abraham's time, they wandered with their flocks and their herds, which was their substance, freely up and down, as did Abraham did, in a country where he was a stranger. Hence, whence it is plain that it is that at least a great part of the land lay in common, that its inhabitants valued it not claim property any more than they made use of. But when there was not room enough in the same place for the herds to feed together, they by consent, as Abraham and Locke did, Genesis 8, 13 chapter 5, separated and enlarged their pasture where it best liked them, and fixed the same reason Esau went from his father and his brother and planted in Mount Seir, Genesis 36, chapter verse 6, chapter 36, verse 6. Section 39. And thus, without supposing any private dominion and property in Adam over all the world, exclusive of all other men, which can no way be proven, nor anyone's property be made out from it, but supposing the world given as it was to the children of men in common, we see how labor could make men distinct titles to several parcels of it for their private use, wherein they could no doubt, wherein they could be no doubt of right, no room for quarrel. So, in other words, he makes the argument is that this early proper, he makes an argument from using the Bible's history of Genesis, makes the account of how hunter-gatherers and gatherers did it, and then until their populations grew bigger, and then they settled, and they started to enclose their land and separate it and make rules in their behavior, and therefore still kind of restrain things, but they're still common use. But then they create a society that then to regulate, and then they create society. Once they all of a sudden became many people, and the land available that immediately at hand available was not as accessible anymore. You created society, right? And then laws emerged, and rules and regulations. Section 40. Nor is it so strange as perhaps before consideration it may appear that the property of labor should be able to overbalance the community of land. For it is labor indeed that puts the difference of value on everything. Again, labor theory. The difference of value in everything is, again, labor, right? And let anyone consider what the difference is between an acre of land planted with tobacco or sugar, shrown with wheat or barley, and an acre of that same land lying in common without any husbandry upon it. And he will find that the improvement of labor makes far greater part of the value. I think it will be but a very modest computation to say that the product of the earth useful to the life of man, 9/10 are the effects of labor. Nay, if we if we will rightly estimate things as they come to our use and cast up the several expenses about them, what in them is purely owing to nature and what to labor, we find that most of them, 99 hundredths, are wholly to be put on account of labor. So therefore, in other words, labor, nature does not really, in other words, Locke makes this even more on account that even though nature provides this and we can do it, and that therefore we get a right to property, but the act of our labor and our cultivation takes what nature has given and improves it dramatically. And therefore, labor produces human labor and cultivation and effort produces useful benefit far greater than nature itself does. Seems to be the argument here. 41. Again, this is why someone like C.B. Macpherson and Strauss argues that Locke is the philosopher of capital. This is the argument that nature, it's not this nature provides, nature may provide it in an early stage, but labor, human contrivance and labor, an industry produces even more, much more, and it's much more beneficial than mere nature. Okay. 41. There cannot be a clear demonstration of anything than the several nations of the Americans are of this, who are rich in land and poor in all the comforts of life, whom nature having furnished as liberal as any other people, with a maturity of plenty, i.e., a fruitful soil, apt to produce in abundance what might serve for food, raiment, and delight, yet for want of approving it by labor, have not 1/100th a part of the contrivances we enjoy, and a king of a very large and fruitful territory there feeds, lodges, and is clad worse than a day laborer in England, by king, a tribal leader. This is his account of the American tribe and Indian tribe. The Indian tribe leader back there, this king that there, is you know uh, um, with large fruitful territory. He feeds, lodges, and is clad worse than a day laborer. Okay, the day laborer in England is what a man working for labor and its services, labors for money or labors for. But he has this wealth because what of all this, all the work and all the labor produces this vast amount of goods that he is able to enjoy through his, have access to. 42. To make this a little clearer, let us but trace some of the ordinary provisions of life through their several progressions before they come to our use, and see how much they receive from their value from human industry. Okay, in other words, think about this. He's saying, in other words, nature just doesn't provide for it. So it's, in fact, having a lot of, this is the argument against Africa. Africa is the most productive. Africa has the most amount of accessible resources easily obtained, but it's so easy to get them. The argument was that no one bothered to work for them, and because that you didn't have to work for them, you didn't have to labor. You just, in other words, that all of a sudden it's scarce. In other words, this is the argument. Locke's argument is interesting because if Locke was right, then Africa should be the biggest, most cultivated, and the best place in the world. But it isn't. Europe was, but Europe had less resources and benefit than Africa. Why? Because it was harsher land originally. It took lots of effort to produce the resources and can take you had to deforest to make fields. You had to, in other words, man's labor produced, in other words, in Africa, in other words, the resources were so fruitful, benefit, you didn't have to do much to get it to survive. But in Europe, you had to do a lot of labor in order to get the resources to survive, and then therefore, but then once you did that, you got more of them, and You did, and you had to work you, and it had to be achieved through labor, where just gathering could do it. Okay, and that's the difference between, let's say, the North American Indians, and in this sense that this is why they never developed anything. They really, as long as the plenty was there, they did not need to produce. Okay, they didn't grow that big, and they didn't do things. Whereas in the South America, they did grow that big, and but they usually created agriculture. So again, this is something that we should look at in that sense. That maybe that the evidence that he uses points kind of throws his argument into more question in that sense. To make this a little clearer, let us trace some of the ordered provisions of life, and he talked about that, right, with the clothing of um, 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 Okay, to make this clearer, let us trace some of the ordinary provisions of life through their several progressions before they came to our use, and see how much they received of value from human industry. Bread, wine, cloth are things of daily use in great plenty, yet, notwithstanding, acorns, water, and leaves and skins must be our bread, drinking, and clothing. Did not labor furnish us with these more useful commodities? And whatever bread is more worth than acorns, wine than water, or cloth or silk than leaves and skins or moss. What is wholly owing to labor and industry, the one of these being food and remnants, which unassisted nature provides us with, the other provisions which our industry and our pains prepare us, which how much they exceed the other in value. When any other hath computed, he will see how much labor makes the far greater part of the value of thing we enjoy in this world, and the ground which produces the material is scarce to be reckoned in, and as any or the most, but a very small part of it, so little that even amongst us, land that is left wholly to nature has no improvement or pasturage, tillage, and planting, and still is called, indeed, it is waste, and we shall find the benefit of it amount to little more than nothing. This shews how much numbers of men are to be preferred to the largest of dominions. How much numbers of men are to be preferred to the largest of dominion, and that the increase of land and the right employment of them, that is the great art of government, and that prince who shall be wise and godlike, and, and by established laws of liberty to secure protection and encouragement to honest industry of mankind against the oppression of powers and narrowness of party, will quickly be too hard for his neighbors. Uh, 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 thus, but this by and by. To return to the argument in hand. In other words, he talks about that all of a sudden the king who did this, the great honor of government, that government helps makes us better. In other words, given that, in other words, art and labor does this great production, government is a new form of this cultivation, and therefore proper government and a king who cultivates, who in other words, a prince who is so wise and godlike that he establishes law of liberty to secure protection and engagement of honest industry, right, against the opposition, these things. By the by, but now return to the argument at hand. Section 43. An acre of land that bears here 20 bushels of wheat, and another in America which the same husbandry would do the like, are without doubt of the same natural intrinsic value, but the benefit mankind receives from one in a year is worth 51, and the other possibly not worth a penny. It is if all profit if all the profit an Indian received from it were to be valued and sold here, at least I may say truly, not 1/10,000th. If it is labor, then which puts the greatest part of value upon land, without which it would scarcely be worth a thing. It is to that we owe the greatest part of of all its useful products. For all that the straw, bread, and the acres of wheat is more worth than the product of an acre of good land, which lies waste, is all the effect of labor. For it is not barely the plowman's pain, the reaper's and threshold's toil, and the baker's sweat is to be counted into the bread we eat. The labor, those who broke the oxen, who digged and wrought the iron and stone, who filled the frame and timbers, employed and plowed, milled, oven, and even other utensils, which are the vast number requisite of this corn, feeding from its feet, being fed to and sown to it being to it being made bread, must all be charged on the account of labor, and received as an effort of that. Nature and the earth furnished only the most worthless material. Nature provides only the worthless. It's all this combined labor of man and this division of labor. There's all these things together. This is that famous eye pencil story, right? The eye how a pencil was made. Eye pencil, that Lawrence Reed famously wrote in the 50s. And I think again, this is the idea. This is a defense of capitalism. This is a defense of division of labor, and the division of labor that produces all this, that produces this great benefit that benefits this thing that nature itself cannot produce. All nature itself is it's waste. If it's not being, if humans don't cultivate it and develop it, yes, it can provide some sustenance for one or two, but our labor can produce sustenance for thousands and thousands, right? Um, uh, worthless material. In other words, must work as material themselves. In other words, let's do this. Made bread must be charged on account of the labor, receiving the effect that nature itself furnished only the most worthless material, as in themselves. It would be a strange catalog. It would be a strange catalog of things that industry provided and made use of about every loaf of bread before it came to our use. If we could trace them, iron, wood, leather, bark, timber, stone, brick, coal, lime, dyeing drugs, pitch, tar, mast, ropes, and all the material made use of in the ship that brought any of the commodities made use of by any of the workmen to any part of the work, by which it would almost it would be almost impossible, at least, too long to reckon up. In other words, it's so in other words, he's saying, imagine if you had to listen to explain of everything. It just, in other words, this is the idea of the complexity of the market. Locke makes an argument about the complexity of labor and the labor market. In other words, the market and the complexity of the nature of people engaging in industry and trade and commerce and exchange that produces all this great benefit and useful things that which gives much more use than nature does. Human industry and human labor produces a vast amount more that this nature itself provides. What nature itself provides is paltry here, it seems to argue here. Okay. Um, Again, this is a very interesting point. In other words, what started out is that nature gives us the right to do this, and all of a sudden, then wait a minute, this human making now produces even almost infinite more benefit than nature provides. Okay. Section 44, for all which it is evident that though the things of nature are given in common, yet man, by him, by being master of himself and proprietor of his own person, and the actions or labors of it, still had in himself the greatest foundation of property, and that which made up the greatest part of what he applied to and support or comfort of being. And the inventions and arts had improved in the contrivances of life, which perfectly of his, and did not belong to belong common to others. In other words, property making things. This is that line, right? In other words, this is the idea of that. Um, that in nature this is like this, but once we have society, once you have this effort of labor and this productions of this, that would apply to the support of the common benefit of his being. When invention and arts has improved the contrivances of life, was perfectly his own and did not belong to others and belong common to others. In other words, it becomes property, its contrivances like this. Thus, labor in the beginning gave a right of property wherever anyone was pleased to employ it upon what was common, while remains a long while and far greater part. And it is yet more than mankind makes use of. Men at first, for the most part, contented themselves with what uninsisted nature offered to their necessities, and thought afterwards in some parts of the world where the increase of the people and stock with the use of money has made land scarce and so of some value, and some communities settled in bonds of their district territories, and by laws within themselves regulated the properties of private men and of their society. And so by compact and agreement settled the property which labor and industry began, and the leagues that has been made between several states and kingdoms, whether expressly or tacitly disowning all claims and rights to the lands of and other uh, uh, the claim to the land in the other's possession, have by common consent given up their pretenses to their natural common right, which originally they had to those countries, and so have by positive agreement settled a property amongst themselves in distinct parts and parcels of the earth. Yet there are still great tracts of ground to be found, which the inhabitants thereof not having joined with the rest of mankind in the consent of the use for their common money, lies waste. In other words, and are more than the people who dwell on it do, or can make use of, or so lies in common, though this can scarce happen among that part of mankind that have consented to use money. So once money comes in, then what happens? Money becomes a mechanism by which you able to accelerate trade, and therefore all the things that you're able to produce by labor now becomes a more accelerated mechanism of of exchanging of this labor and these goods and these things to buy these goods and services, and and therefore this expands the possibility of use. So therefore, um, as labor magnifies, human industry and labor magnifies and produces much greater things, commerce and exchange allows, but money helps commerce and exchange be more efficient in this sense, right? And allows for the greater proportion that then requires society. It seems to be the argument. In other words, but then this is an interesting claim. If people aren't developing it, aren't utilizing it, aren't producing it, and they're just leaving it there, this thing there, Locke seems to say they lose their right to do it. In other words, if other people come now, in other words, until you've enclosed and made the society that does then all of a sudden cultivates the land and produces industry. In other words, that the industry that this produces great benefit for everyone, manifest. But if you're just letting the land waste and not doing it, this is the attack. I mean, isn't this a kind of criticism of the American Indians? Oh, they just let the land waste, they're not developing it, and therefore they have no right to it anymore. In other words, if I come along and change it, they could have changed it, they didn't. See, therefore, in Locke, there's almost an implicit by this understanding of here is that the person who cultivates it is actually being a benefactor to mankind, and the person who just lazy about it is actually wasting it, not utilizing it to its maximum benefit of mankind. And therefore, to what degree then all of a sudden the guy, someone from someplace else, comes to this place that these people aren't enclosing land, they're not doing this. Ooh, what happens? Well, tough luck. You don't, you could have enclosed it. You could have done something, but you chose not to. Oops. 46. The greatest part of things really useful to the life of man, such as the necessity of subsisting, made the first commoners of the world look after, as it doth the Americans now, are generally things of short duration, such as, if they are not consumed by use, will decay and perish of themselves. Gold, silver, and diamonds are things that fancy or agreement has put value on more than of real use, and necessity supports of life. Now, of those good things which nature has provided in common, everyone had a right, as had as hath been said, to as much as he could use, and property in all that he could effect with his labor, all that this industry could extend to alter from the state of nature had put in it was his. He that gathered 100 bushels of acorns or apples had thereby a property in them as his goods as soon as they were gathered, and he only and was only to look that he used them before they spoiled, else he could else he took more than his share and robbed others. And indeed, it was a foolish thing, as well as dishonest, to hoard up more than he could make use of. If he gave way to part of any, if he gave way a part to anybody else, so it perished not usefully in his possession. These he made use of. These he also made use of, and he and if he had also bartered away plums that would have rotted in a week for nuts that would last good for eating a whole year, he did no injury. In other words, he wasted not the common stock. He destroyed no part of the portions of good belonging to others, as long as nothing perished unless uselessly in his hand. So wait a minute. So I conquer all the pears, right? Well, if they rot, then it's I violated. I'm a bad boy. I violated the rule. But if I take what I don't need and won't use, and I sell to get something that won't spoil, then I'm not done anything wrong. And I've also, by doing this, I've increased the benefit of things by exchanging that person has things he didn't have. He had nuts, he didn't want nuts, but now he has the pears. Okay. In other words, but that exchange is a contract. Okay, that contract and that exchange creates in Latin. This is what societas is. Those contractual things. So he did no injury, he wasted no common stock, destroyed no portion of the goods that belonged to others, so long as nothing perished in use of his hands. And again, if he would give his nuts for a piece of metal pressed with its color, or exchange his sheep for shells, or wool for a sparkling pebble or a diamond, and keep those by him in all his life, he invaded not the rights of others. He might heap up as much as these durable things as he pleased, the exceeding of his bounds of his property not lying in the largesse of his possessions, but in the perishings of anything usely in it. In other words, but the perishing of anything usely. So therefore, in other words, the argument is that the limit here is that if it's perishable, if you're wasting it. But if I traded these things for things that are imperishable, and they're like gold or silver money or rocks or jewelry. Uh, 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 um, uh, and I just keep these forever. These don't rot. These don't decay. Money doesn't decease. It lasts forever. Then what happens? Then there's no. In other words, in nature, what rots or spoils is waste. But excessive money or excessive things is not necessary waste. Now, the argument will be that it is if it's dead, it's not doing it. In other words, capital must always be making something or building something or using something. If this is the concept of dead capital, some people say. A dead capital is capital or resources that are not productive, okay? That are just waste. And therefore, is dead capital just as much a crime as someone having property and letting it spoil? This is the next dimension of Locke in that this capitalist idea. This is Hernando de Soto's comment, right? The dead capital. Um, 47. Thus came in the use of money, some lasting thing that men might keep without spoil, and by mutual consent men would take in exchange for the truly useful, the useful but perishable support of life. 48. Therefore, this is the money. Money emerges as a means to that we can store forever. Okay, so therefore, I can use all this as property, use all these things, and I will exchange it to others. Others give me something else. Now, in other words, what happens if people don't then they create means to allow for exchange. Okay, um, money becomes a means to help expedite exchange, and I can store that if this unperishable thing can be stored and held in large, then that's it. 48. It is a as different degrees of industry were apt to give men possessions in different proportions. So this invention of money gave them the opportunity to continue and enlarge them. For supposing an island separate from all possible commerce with the rest of the world, where there were but of 100 families, but there were sheep, horses, and cows, and other useful animals, wholesome fruits, and enough corn for 100,000 times as many, but nothing in the island, either because of the commonness or perishableness, fit the supply, fit to supply the place of money. What reason could anyone have there to enlarge his possessions beyond the use of his family, and a plentiful supply of its consumption, whether what is either in what their own industry produced or could bother for like perishable useful commodities in another? In other words, he's basically saying if there's a society that's enclosed, there's no possibility of trade, and therefore, and the number of population is kind of limited, and everyone has these resources. There's going to be not the success or something. There's not going to be any need of money in the sense. Where there is not something both lasting and scarce, and so valuable to be hoarded up, their men will not be apt to enlarge their possession of land, were it ever so rich, nor so free for them to take. For I ask, what would a man value 10,000 or 100,000 acres of excellent land, readily cultivated, or one stocked to one and the well stocked to with cattle in the middle of island, the inland parts of America, where he had no hopes of commerce with other parts of the world, to draw money to him by the scale of his product? It would not be worth them enclosing. We should see him give up to the wild common nature whatsoever more would supply the contrivances of life to be had there for him and his family. In other words, if there's no trade, there's no commerce, there's no development, and you're stuck here. In other words, his argument is almost like, well, in America, there's no because it can't be easily shipped over here, can't be enjoyed and traded. It's over there. I have this great land in the middle of America. You can, you can make this very productive thing, but what use is it? Who can enjoy it? It's not enough people to buy it and think, well, wait a minute. What happens if you can ship it there easily? Okay. What happens if you can ship it there easily? Uh, uh, what happens if the speed of transportation is so fast that that it won't spoil? In other words, I can produce it there and I can make it, and all of a sudden now I can sell it to a place where the value of it is high. Wait a minute. So in other words, his own argument seems to, wait a minute, why can't this not? Why are you saying this is not so? This is only so because there's not an effective system of commerce. But once you have an effective system of commerce, then why not go and develop those other places in that sense? In other words, there is kind of almost an imperialism in Locke, that Locke system, Locke's view of things. In other words, it's the whites being burdened. That, oh my God, these people aren't developing. Well, they've been developing. We developed already. They're not. Well, then we have, in other words, their failure to develop means that if I develop that, it's mine, and I'm using it, and I can also trade it. It's not wasting. You see? And all of a sudden, this becomes a justification for imperialism. And that native populations have no rights in this sense if they're not utilizing it. If they're not taking the land and utilizing it in Locke, then use it or lose it, baby. Use it or lose it. You lose it, okay? Therefore, if you're not utilizing the land and cultivating the land and maximizing the usefulness of it, then, and you're not able to trade it and exchange it, therefore, the fact that these people who come in who have commerce behind them and trade and networks to supply, they can produce great parts of lands, not waste it because they can now bring it to other markets and get coin and perishable things. And what about the Indians? Well, it's not. I'm not wasting it. It's nothing is being wasted. And so therefore, SOL, baby, you didn't do it. You had your chance. Thus, at the beginning of the world was America, and more so than that is now. For no such thing as money was anywhere known. Find out something. That hath the use and value of money amongst his neighbors. You shall see the same man will begin presently to enlarge his possessions. So with money, what the accusation of capital becomes easier. In other words, trade becomes easier. And once you have trade, you can have surplus without waste. And once you have surplus without waste, then once you have more opportunities. In other words, this is the emergence of capitalism in a sense. 50. But since gold and silver, being little use to life of man in possession to food, in proportion to food, raiment and carriage. In other words, now raiment means the ability to food to eat, and raiment is, I think that's clothing and something like this, and carriage is someplace to store yourself, right? It has value only from the consent of men. Whereof labor yet makes in great part the measure. It is plain that men have agreed to a disproportionate and unequal possession of the earth. They having, by tacit and voluntary consent, found out a way how a man may fairly possess more land than he himself can use the product of, by receiving in exchange for the overplus gold and silver, which may be hoarded up without injury to anyone. These metals not spoiling or decaying in hands of the possessor. This partage of things, this partage of things in an inequality of private possessions, men have made practicable out of the bonds of society, without compact, only by putting a value on gold and silver and tacitly agreeing in the use of money. For in governments, the laws regulate the right of property, and the possessions of land is determined by positive constitution. So, what's even interesting, he even seems to argue that the nature of value of thing, gold, the natural, that this is interesting. I mean, I don't, this right here is a little confusing. In other words, this partage of inequality, possession of property, men have made practicable out of bounds of society without compact, only by putting value on gold and silver. And in other words, there's a contract here, but not one of society. But once you have a contract, you have society. Once you have an agreement about the value, once we agree, men value that gold is worth this much, there is society in the sense. You have you have government. So there's a trick here. Locke assumes that now money is before political reality, but gold and silver is. This is why the see gold and silver only has this is the we have these people out there. We have gold standard. Well, no, gold is only value again. But the Austrians are right. Value is subjective. Therefore, the value of gold is only because it's useful as a means of exchange, and that the benefit of it. What happens all of a sudden when someone finds a lot of gold? What happens to the value of gold? The value of gold is based upon supply and demand, right? And the demand is high because we think it's valuable. But what happens if the supply of gold triples? What happens then? Does the value of the gold stay the same? No, it decreases. Same, and this is true of any means of exchange. This happens with money as well. Money is just, in other words, gold and silver are just means of exchange. It's a means to facilitate exchange in this sense. And therefore, by this logic, um, it's not in other words, men make it, it is something that men agree to. And it's by consent because of its usefulness, in fact, one can argue. Again, if it's no longer useful, if the gold is not useful, then why would people? Gold and silver is useful. See, this is where Locke is interesting. Locke seems to make the argument is that I think even this is why it's not interesting, but it's odd. The argument about the imperishableness of the well, why would you want more of it? It's unperishable, and you're not violating your thing, but it's not useful. If the gold, if all the silver and gold there, you're not making some use of it. Isn't that waste? Isn't this all this capital that is not being utilized, not being productive? Is this not a form of waste as much as the person wasting? In other words, the nature, the natural land that not being cultivated, and this, in other words, I mean, this is a very important thought to think about for that sense. In other words, if a government laws regulate the right of property, and this is another thing. And therefore, you have the right of government. See, this is what's interesting. In the property here moves from what is in the state of nature to at the end we're getting to the state of society. Okay, money, regulations, rules. Okay, this is why there's libertarians. Oh, but nature, we don't need government. Locke kind of puts this. There's a little bit of Locke like there that hints at this, right here. These in chapter 50, that there seems to be that money emerges prior to. It happens as a kind of spontaneous agreement, but if such agreement is a form of society, that maybe even that is a social contract, then to what degree is this not a political society? Okay, a 51. And thus, I think it is very easy to contrive without any difficulty how labor could first begin a title of property in the common things of nature, and how spending it upon our uses and bound it, so that there could be no reason for quarreling about title, nor any doubt about the largeness of possession it gave. Right in uh, 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 conveniency went together. For as man had a right to all he could employ his labor upon, he had no temptation to labor for more than he could make use of. This left room for controversy. This left no room for controversy about title, nor any encroachment on the rights of others. What portion a man carved for himself was easily seen, and it was useless, uh, as much as dishonest, to carve himself too much or more than he needed. So he then goes back to the state of nature. 51 returns us back to the state of nature, where and it justifies this idea that there's limits to this. Even though he brings the object to this limitless productive thing, that in fact the idea that, wait a minute, that man's industry produces even more than nature does. But now he kind of returns us to this to make the idea that, okay, but even then it's not really that contrivance, because there's a limit to it, and there's not going to be this. There's not going to be the war of all against all. Okay. Um, I think this ends the chapter. Yeah, it ends the chapter. Yeah, it ends the chapter. So we turn next time to paternal power. I'm going to end here. We went really long because it was a long chapter. I didn't want to break it up. Maybe I should have broken up. Maybe you're going to be tired and not want to listen to this. If you have any questions, put them below, and I will answer them when I see them. Please, if you like it, like it. If you don't like it, don't like it. Put your criticisms on there also. I know there's going to be of something maybe, because I'm being controversial a little bit here and there. Um, if you want, subscribe. If you like it, share it with a friend. Subscribe and encourage others to subscribe. You can follow me on social media. That information is below. Also, if you want to help me do this, help support me in any way, you can do so. Subscribe star Patreon. I haven't checked things in a while. I should be bad. Why? Because it helps me. Anything that does their little bit of, or you can, as I've been said my last time, if you don't want to support me through that, you can always go to buy my recent book, my notebook on Aristotle politics, um, um, uh, uh, um, uh, by Lulu, or if you buy it by Lulu, you actually give me more money. If you buy it by Amazon, Amazon gets profit. Yeah, in other words, the profit. If you buy it by Lulu, the profit Amazon gets, I would get. But if you want to buy it by Amazon, because it's easier to get Amazon, Amazon doesn't charge you the thing, so I'll still make some money on it. That's the way you can help me buy the book. But that's it. Okay. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye.